So this is the second section of the book on plants. The third section will be on animals. And this first chapter is just a basic, simple introduction to how plants work. Cows. The caption is, hey, wait a minute. This is grass. We've been eating grass. Well, that's the thing about plants. Plants are the bottom of the food chain. They, and I'll write this down in a second, they take carbon dioxide in from the atmosphere or from the water if they're in the water. Carbon dioxide dissolves pretty well in water. And they use light as an energy source to stick the carbons together. So they take 6 carbon dioxides, and out of that they get a sugar molecule called glucose, C6H12O6. As I'll show it to you in a second. You don't really need to know that part of it, and that is the basic fuel that they run on and that everything else runs on, is that you can take and pull those carbons back apart and use the energy that used to be light, that is now holding carbons together, they call it bond energy, to do other things inside a cell. And once you've got that all going, you can pull other bonds apart. But the producers are the bottom of the food chain. Everything else is depending on them to produce the basic fuel that everybody else runs on. Now, no system is 100% efficient. This system isn't really all that efficient. The energy at the bottom of the food chain in the plants doesn't transfer up to the first level of consumers in any large fraction. And then the things that eat the things that eat the plants, you lose a lot more of the energy. And then as you go up the food chain, there's less and less energy available, and less energy makes the transfer. Every time you move energy around, you have to lose a little of it. But a lot of times, most of this energy just winds up being kind of siphoning off to a type of consumer called decomposers, things that break down dead plants and dead animals and dead everything, and waste materials that are not completely broken down. The decomposers recycle the materials, but they, in using the extra energy kind of fritters away as heat. And that happens. Every time you move energy from one spot to another, it doesn't all go, some of it fritters away as heat. It's a law of physics, actually. This kind of shows that. The light energy comes in as light. It goes into the producers. They're taking materials and using carbon dioxide and water. I'll put that, it's up. Goes to the consumers, eventually broken down by the decomposers, which are bacteria and funguses and insects and a bunch of things that work down dead materials. But the energy here doesn't go back. The material goes back, but the energy is gradually, and you could have heat coming out everywhere. Heat is just kind of random, chaotic motion. That's why if you warm stuff up, is that things expand because the particles are random, chaotic motion. They bounce off of one another more. They space themselves out, and it's usable in some forms, but mostly doesn't wind up getting used. So, this is the plant chapter. These are the processes. Hard to fit this all in here. again, for people that like to know how the details work. Water contributes the hydrogens that wind up over here. And that leaves the oxygen to come off as a byproduct. 6 of these get stuck together as 6 of these. You wind up using 6 of these to produce the 12 of these. There's 6 of these, 12 of those, and so some of those come off as oxygen as well. So this is a process that produces oxygen. Now the process going backwards, what they call aerobic respiration, is what a tremendous number of living things do. The plants do it when they need to use the sugar, animals do it. There are other ways to get the energy out of here that doesn't use oxygen, but largely aerobic respiration is oxygen plus glucose produces water and carbon dioxide. And the energy that used to be in here is mostly siphoned off into another molecule that's actually a much more usable for energy molecule that we're not going to get into because that's not what this course is about. But in terms of plants, plants have their own energy needs, so that's what they're doing with the glucose. But plants are also built out of starches, paper towels, made from plant starches. There's many molecules of glucose in here, all stuck together very kind of rigidly, and that's how plants hold themselves up. And in fact, animals are the only group where you don't find cell walls, actually walls around the lipid membrane of the cells that gives them more rigidity. It helps give the plant structure, it gives fungus the structure, it's somewhat protective for bacteria. There's all sorts of things that have cell walls. We don't because we need some flexibility. But plants take glucose and stick them together into starches. A lot of those starches they want to stick around, right? The starches in the paper towel, those cells aren't alive anymore, but the cellulose is still pretty good material. Trees, green plants, what we call plant fiber, is very stable. And in fact, it's so stable that our digestive systems can't break it down. You need a very specialized digestive system, usually with a lot of little buddies that help break it down, bacteria and other things that you get in cow stomachs and termite digestive systems and things like that. But we call it plant fiber. It goes in one end of us and out the other. But plants do produce starches that we can digest. Why? Well, because they will store this stuff for later in the roots, like you get with carrots and onions and such. In the cores sometimes, definitely in seeds, so that they can use it later for energy and to build new leaves or to build, or for the seed to sprout. And those starches, they don't want them to be super stable because they're gonna have to break them down and use the bits and pieces for those. So we tend to look at plants that have digestible starches that we can digest. The plants wanted to be able to break those down to use those too. And then non-digestible starches, the structural starches, that the plants really didn't want to have fall apart. You're gonna have to write this stuff down because I'm gonna leave this up here, so I'm not gonna scribble. So plants need carbon dioxide. Land plants get the carbon dioxide from the air. They get minerals and water from the ground. So they need the minerals. There's a mineral in chlorophyll. There's minerals, remember we run on proteins. A lot of our proteins use minerals to help them do things, or have minerals actually embedded in them. We have iron embedded in our hemoglobin. Plants have iron that helps the process of photosynthesis to go round and round and round. So they have a bunch of mineral needs. Now the water comes up. This gets tricky in plants. We'll talk about this later. But the plants need carbon dioxide to come in, so they need the carbon dioxide to get into the cells. So they need to open access to the air. But whenever they open access to the air, the waters that come up from the ground can evaporate away. They call it transpiration. It actually contributes a lot of water to the atmosphere. But the plant doesn't want to lose water. So they get very controlled about opening their pores to get some carbon dioxide in and lose as little water as possible before they slam them shut. So that's a process that will come up later. Okay, there's one thing that's not on here that's really important: nitrogen. Nitrogen, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air, there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, but the nitrogen in the air is not in a form that a plant can use. They need nitrates. And for nitrates, they have little buddies embedded in their roots, little bacteria or funguses that they carried with them when they first evolved to be land plants. And those guys can take the nitrogen and combine it with oxygen and make nitrates. Actually, I am going to write this stuff down. Just realized. There are broad swaths of the ocean where there's basically no ecosystem because there's no producers, there's no plants, because some of the minerals that they need don't get very far out from the continents before they're either used by the plants or they precipitate, they drop to the bottom. Iron being one of the major ones. Not a lot of iron in the surface waters way out away from the continents. It runs off from erosion, but doesn't get very far. Actually combines with oxygen. We'll talk about that later. We actually talked about it, the precipitation of iron that you can see in the sediments when photosynthesis first arose. And I just mentioned nitrates. So the nitrates that are mostly produced by their symbionts. They give them a place to live, they give them some nice food, and these bacteria or funguses pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, pull it apart, which is very difficult to do, and then combine it with oxygen to make nitrates. And from nitrates, plants can make amino acids. And from the amino acids, they make proteins. And remember, proteins is what we run all of our chemistry on. Plants do that too. Phosphates, one of the major use for phosphates. Now, phosphates are sometimes produced by symbionts, or just a mineral pulled out of the ground. But there's a molecule called ATP. Remember I said that when glucose is broken apart, that energy is fed into a molecule that's a more usable fuel. This is the more usable fuel. And so ATP, phosphates, really important to have phosphates. This is why fertilizers need to be a source of nitrates and phosphates. That's what makes them useful as fertilizers. Okay, now, what else have we got? Light, big deal, right? The first producers actually used heat as an energy source to put stuff together, because that was a simpler process. But heat was only available in some very hot places, like hot cracks in the bottom of the ocean. Not hot enough. You don't get enough heat just in warm places for that. But eventually, light detection and heat processing combined into a light processing system, photosynthesis. Now, light comes in a lot of flavors, a lot of frequencies. Well, I'm going to move this and move it back. So, light travels through the world as a wave, electromagnetic wave. And what we call visible light is a very small part of all of the different waves of electromagnetic energy. Why do we call it visible light? Because our light detection systems can pick it up. Why is it a very narrow part of this? Because on the surface of the Earth, most of this stuff is not really around. So using a detection system for gamma rays wouldn't do us much good. There's no gamma rays around us to pick up. As much as, we love the idea of Superman and his X-ray vision, there's not a lot of X-rays around. If you had an X-ray, if you could pick up X-rays with your vision, you wouldn't see much because X-rays don't reach the surface of the Earth. Maybe they reach the surface of Krypton, who knows. As we get close to the visible light, you get ultraviolet. That's because the first wavelength coming from high energy to low energy, the first color you see is purple. And the last color you see is red, and then beyond the red is what we call infrared. Now, there is a decent amount of ultraviolet and infrared around us in the world, and some animals can see ultraviolet. Some animals can see infrared. Infrared comes off hot things. And then you have microwaves, which actually aren't, micro, you would think they would mean that they were smaller. They're actually getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then radio waves. Here's the wave. That's a wave of a kilometer, over half a mile. That's a pretty big wave. But the peaks are very far apart. Now, all of this stuff in the same medium travels at the same speed. So, the closer together the waves are, the more of them hit you in a second, right? The waves are really close together, in a second, a whole bunch of them hit you. The waves are really far apart, in a second, not very many of them hit you. And so that's how this type of energy, how the wave connects to the energy. The longer the wavelength between two peaks, the less energy there is. And the fewer things hit you in a second, so the lower the frequency. Long wavelength, low frequency, low energy. Short wavelengths, high frequency, high energy. So here's your visible light. Now, plants pick up mostly this range. I'm sorry, they reflect mostly this range. They pick up light from here and use the energy. They pick up light from here and use the energy. When people first designed plant lights, they're going to grow plants inside, and they wanted the biggest bang for their wattage buck. They put purple lights in. If you buy a really old plant light, it is distinctly purple. But the problems they found out with, you have to have people in there with the plants because they have to be taken care of, and people don't really like to work under purple lights. So modern plant lights look white, is that they've got enough of this in there that when our light detectors process all the colors together, then we tell our brain decides that's what white light is. There is no such thing as white light. It's a construct of your brain. It's all of these things together, and light intensity. But purple, being a short wavelength, is actually more energetic than red would be. If you look in the book, there's actually a couple of graphs that show you the light that the plants absorb, the chlorophyll absorbs. They're pointing at a couple. Absorb light in this frequency, absorb light in that frequency. If you're underneath the plant, green comes bouncing back off. Green makes it through because it's not absorbed. And that's how light works. It gets bounced off of stuff. It gets bounced around by stuff. The atmosphere bounces blue around. That's why if you look away from the sun, that's mostly the color that you can see, because it's been bouncing around and before it comes down to you, and most of the other ones are coming directly down from the sun. You look near the sun, you'll notice the sky looks white. There's what they call re-radiation, where the light comes into something, juices it a little bit because the material can absorb it. The material that got juiced up is unstable. It tends to go back to the way it was and let energy out, but it's lost some, remember? It's lost some in the meantime, so it comes out at a different frequency. That's how they know what's in space dust. I described that at the beginning of that chapter, where you can read the frequencies coming from distant stars and tell what's in between, what materials are absorbing and re-radiating the light. And this stuff is that this light gets absorbed and re-radiated as electrons. Not something you really need to know. The major energy absorber, light absorber in photosynthesis is chlorophyll. We've all heard of chlorophyll. And it looks green because it doesn't absorb green, it bounces the green back out. It's not the only light absorber in plants. There are other pigments, colored materials. The other pigments, a bunch of them are collected under the term carotenoids. The original one, here's a big surprise, the original one isolated from carrots, it was carotene, and it's orange. Carotenoids and some of the other pigments will absorb some frequencies the chlorophyll's not that good at, and basically take that energy, absorb it, and then kind of go, here chlorophyll, here's some extra. So it boosts the ability of the chlorophyll to do photosynthesis. It gets a little bit of extra electrons from these other pigments. Now, the other pigments are used for other things too. Because they're energetic, they do various things, but one of the major things that you can see is that since they do reflect different colors than green, they can be used to make parts of a plant a different color than green. Why? You got a flower. You're ready to spread your sperm onto other flowers. The sperm is packaged in pollen, the pollen's ready to go. How do you get it to the other flowers? Well, sometimes you release it into the air, and then, the flowers are green, they don't look like flowers. But a lot of times, you need to have buddies come in, pollinators, pick the pollen up and carry it away. And you gotta give them a bribe to get them to do it. Usually food. So how do they know the food's there? You make the flower stand out against the green background by filling it with carotenoids and pulling the chlorophyll out of it so that you get colored flowers against the green background, and bees can see that, and moths and beetles and whatever your other pollinators are can see that. The same thing kind of happens when the seeds are ready to go. Is that a lot of fruits are, the way that a fruit is basically a structure to spread seeds. We'll cover that later. And it doesn't always involve an edible fruit. But edible fruits, again, you don't want them to be eaten before the seeds are ready to go. So a lot of edible fruits form green and eventually turn color as a message to the seed spreaders. Here, take this. And what happens with an apple is the animal eats the apple, the seeds go in one end and out the other, and it spreads them away from the plant. It takes a while to go in one end and out the other. And this edible part of the fruit is a bribe, basically. And the color is a signal that these are ready to go. The tomatoes are ready to go. The oranges are ready to go. The lemons are ready to go. Is that a lot of carotenoids are in the yellow, red, orange range. So you're looking at a body of water, and it looks blue. Not always, but nice pure water, depending on the minerals in it, very often has a blue tinge, because a lot of blue comes right back out as soon as the light hits it. And so it looks blue. Sometimes it looks green because there's plants in there. And the plants are green, and it reflects the green out through the water. Water itself doesn't react with every frequency the same. Some frequencies get in a very short distance and get absorbed. And the deeper you go, the different the color penetration is. The frequencies that get farther and farther down are different frequencies. Algae uses different light collectors, different chlorophylls, and sometimes other types of pigments, because they need to absorb the light that actually reaches them. And what you get typically, I've got to see this, is that up near the surface you get the green algae. A little bit deeper, you get golden algae, distinctly yellowish algae. It's absorbing different frequencies of the light that gets down there. The deepest algae is the red algae. And there are places where red algae grow, where if you and I were down there scuba diving, we would think there was no light at all, because our eyes are not that sensitive to those frequencies of red, and they're not a lot of, it's not a lot of red gets down there, but it's enough to keep a layer of algae going. Now there's also brown algae. Brown algae it grows closer to the surface. It isn't kind of limited. The other algae kind of work by depth. Brown algae work in a bunch of different depths, including up near the surface sometimes, like kelp. But algae is the original plant, the original multi-celled plant. It's so simple that it's not considered to be in the plant kingdom, it's considered to be in the protist kingdom. So this is actually the first group of plants that we're dealing with, but the rest of this section on plants is going to be about plants that moved onto the land, from the simple ones to the more complex ones. And we'll pick that up in the next chapter.